Statistically speaking, you're most likely watching this on a mobile device, likely either running Android or iOS. However, about 35.8% of you are watching on a computer running some version of Windows. Unfortunately, YouTube won't supply me with the statistics detailed down to the exact version of Windows, so I turned to an external website to find some additional statistics. While there, I noticed that even in 2020, 0.71% of all Windows-based computer systems are running Windows XP, an operating system that came out nearly 20 years ago. And are people actually still putting up with Vista? Christ, I'd rather have Linux than Vista. Like, that at least actually works. Regardless, that got me thinking, what's the Windows XP experience like 19 years later in our modern era of 2020? So I set out on a journey of definitely buying a legitimate copy of the software and not downloading random Windows XP ISOs until something worked. The system I was installing the software on was one you've seen and will continue to see on this channel, the box computer. Inside is a powerful single-core Pentium 4 631 clocked at 3 GHz strapped down to some random LGA 775 motherboard. The 631 was built off the 65nm process, has a TDP of 86 watts, has a 2 MB L2 cache, and debuted in the first quarter of 2006, the same year as Vista did. Inside the case, if that's what you want to call it, are also two 2 GB sticks of DDR2 memory, an AMD HD 4850, a random IDE hard drive I had lying around, and a power supply whose wires completely comply with all OSHA regulations. Installing XP on this system actually took much longer than I anticipated. For a while, I kept trying to boot from a USB stick, but it refused to work no matter what I did, kinda. You see, I could boot from a CD via USB or a floppy disk via USB, but I couldn't boot from a mass storage device with a USB connection. So I studied the archaic practice of burning CDs since my typical method wasn't applicable this time around. And a few confusing hours later, I was in. I'd finally got 64-bit Windows XP Professional up and running on a single-core Pentium, a build straight out of the early 2000s. Before we get into the rest of the video though, how about you take a moment to like, comment, or subscribe because you made it this far, which means you probably enjoy the content. Thanks. With Windows done installing, I then restarted the computer just for good measure, and when I got back in, the nostalgia associated with the OS really started hitting me. It was the same OS as the first computer I ever played games on, and the same OS as the first laptop I could ever call my own. But here I was, a decade later, returning to my roots and abandoning Windows 10 for a day. The first thing I noticed was the lack of desktop icons, which is a good thing. When I bought my daily driver laptop, it was loaded with all sorts of superfluous programs like Candy Crush and a bunch of other Acer Aspire specific software. Granted, some of the Acer softwares are actually useful, and I've kept a couple around, but I've gotten rid of most of them. But that's what I had, a fresh, perfect install of Windows XP. As expected, the basic OS performance was just great. At idle, without anything open, the CPU was seeing 0 to 1% utilization and RAM usage was around 1/4 gig. Now, I noticed a few things straight out of the gate. First of all, what in the world is this background? I've never seen it before and much preferred the iconic Bliss background. So I changed it and sought out the popular pinball game, except that there were all sorts of other games as well. I remember some of the games like Solitaire and Minesweeper, but not some of the other ones like FreeCell, Hearts, or all of the internet games. I can't recall these at all, but let me know if you played them in the comments section below. There was one aspect that definitely needed fixing though, the graphics drivers. Moving around any window was extremely laggy, like even by 4 MB GPU standards, so I hopped onto Internet Explorer to download the drivers. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to load the webpage, but we'll get back to that later, and in the meantime, I opted to download it on a USB stick with a separate PC. This is when I realized that the HD 4850 doesn't have drivers for Windows XP and support for the GPU only goes back to Windows Vista. So, to make a long story short, I swapped out the AMD card with an even older NVIDIA one, the GeForce 6200A, and installed the drivers for that card. It's not nearly as powerful as the 4850, but it's definitely more appropriate for the XP era of computing. Now that Windows was running considerably smoother, I peeked around a bit in system properties and realized that the system was only using 3.25 GB of the 4 GB of RAM available to it. Well, it turns out the Windows XP only supports up to 3.25 GB of RAM. I got to looking around out of sheer curiosity and figured out that in October of 2001, 256 MB of RAM would set you back about $50. Given this, it would take 9 sticks of this RAM to reach 3.25 GB, which would have cost you about $450. This, given inflation, is about $662 in 2020. Nowadays, that kind of money could get you well over 100 GB of RAM and really shows how far technology has come in the last 2 decades. But the video is titled, "Can you use Windows XP in 2020?" or something to that effect. I don't know yet, but let's try just that. We'll start with web browsing and work our way up into common applications such as Steam, Chrome, and a couple of games. First things first though, the internet. According to StatCounter, as of November 2020, Internet Explorer still somehow manages to account for 1.13% of the worldwide browser market share. I'm honestly surprised the percentage was that high and figured that most people would have moved on by now since it doesn't always work well with modern websites. But I tried it for myself and started off with YouTube. Officially, YouTube does not support Internet Explorer and refused to work with the browser. In fact, most web pages didn't aside from a simple Bing or Google search. Because of this, I couldn't install Chrome through this computer and had to download it on a USB stick with a second computer. I did that, ran the setup, and it failed, saying that no update was available. So I did it again, this time with an older version of Chrome, version 49, which then threw up another error. Okay, that's fine, I thought, and went back to an even older version, version 42. This one didn't work either, so I then opted to install SlimJet. I've never heard of it before, but it worked without a hitch. Kinda. Whenever I'd load a website such as YouTube or Wikipedia for the first time, it'd throw up a privacy error or something to that effect that I'd always have to bypass. But I was really doing it. I was using Windows XP 19 years later and it was still functioning. Mostly. It still had its fair share of issues, such as when I tried watching a YouTube video that ultimately refused to load. My internet really isn't good, but I know that that wasn't the issue, and after 4 minutes of loading, I abandoned the attempt and went around to some other websites to see how they held up. The two main ones that I checked out were Reddit and Wikipedia. Both websites were pretty slow to load and images wouldn't properly appear even after idling for over a minute. So, is it usable? I suppose so, but if you want to watch videos or see embedded images, then you're out of luck. Maybe some other browsers work better with Windows XP, but the point is that this operating system is quite a hassle to use on the internet in 2020. Either way, I guess that the internet worked usably, so I see this as a victory, and with this in mind I had high hopes about getting Steam running on this computer. I found a video by i430VX which seemed promising, and the method seemed to be working with my system, until it didn't, and repeated the same error whenever I tried to log into my Steam account. Either way, Steam support for Windows XP ended on the 1st of January in 2019, so I guess it's a miracle that I got this far in the first place. Not to let your hopes down though, there's still plenty of games that will run just fine on this operating system. There was a time, long ago, where PC games weren't bought and sold through an application with thousands of titles at the tip of your fingers and you actually had to go to a physical store to buy a physical copy of the game. I've not necessarily done that, but I do have a few games from that era that should run on this system. Before that, I thought that I'd get MSI Afterburner all set up so we could see the system utilization overlay while in-game. Luckily, Afterburner actually supports Windows XP, so I downloaded it, got it all set up, and tried to launch it. Unfortunately, RivaTuner Statistics Server, the part of the program that actually deals with the overlay, didn't want to work, even though it supports XP and should have performed just fine. With this, all I could really do was overclock the card with Afterburner, so I installed Fraps to get the in-game overlay instead. The first game I ran was Far Cry 1, which automatically selected the lowest settings in a resolution of 800 by 600. I decided to leave it as such and hopped into the first mission. On average, the frame rate ranged from the upper 30s to the lower 40s, but was playable throughout without any stuttering or input lag. This got me thinking that maybe I could try overclocking the card to get some extra performance out of it. I was able to get a small overclock running on it, roughly 20 MHz on the core and memory, but anything higher caused the game to lag uncontrollably to the point where it couldn't properly load the opening sequence of this game. With this, I reverted the clock speeds and started up some COD 2. I couldn't launch single player for whatever reason, but starting a lonesome multiplayer lobby worked just fine. With the highest settings in a resolution of 1280 by 800, the frame rate was in the upper teens. I then put on all the lowest settings, and in the same resolution, the game pulled a better frame rate in the upper 30s and the mid 40s. An interesting thing to note, but on the highest settings, the smoke effects coming from the ground had a weird sort of green distortion to them, while on the lowest settings, the graphical glitch went away. I mentioned this because in the next game I tested, Grand Theft Auto 3, the opening cutscene had similar glitches to the ones we saw in COD 2. At the start of GTA 3, I was running the game with all the highest settings without frame sync or frame limiter in 1280 by 800p. But with these settings, the first cutscene was a mess of discoloration, ghosting, and inconsistent frame rates. When I got into the actual gameplay, the FPS was in the mid-teens, but the input lag was terrible. Shortly afterwards, when I dropped the settings to their lowest, the graphical glitches went away and the frame rate increased to the low 20s. Unfortunately, there was still way too much input lag for this game to be considered playable by any means. Oh yeah, and people use computers for work stuff too. Here's me using Wordpad to type some stuff. I use this because I don't have any copies of Microsoft Office, but I'm sure the older versions of the program would run just fine. So that's that. That's how Windows XP holds up in 2020. There's a few more things I'd like to cover though that may or may not have been the fault of the dated operating system. First off was the resolution. The monitor that I was using for this video has a standard 16:9 display that supports resolutions up to 1600:900. However, when I used any resolution higher than 1280 by 800, bits of the program, game, or whatever I was using at the moment would poke off the edge of the screen where I could not see them. I've not had this happen before, and I found this peculiar, if anything, but if you have any idea why this was happening, then let me know in the comments below. Speaking of monitors, during my display calibration adventures, I also came across a feature named N-View Properties. I've never seen these settings before, and there were some pretty cool features here. For example, I turned on an option that caused whatever window I was dragging around at that time to become semi-transparent so I could see behind it. At first I thought this would be annoying, but it turned out to actually be pretty cool. There's a bunch of things you can do in this application as well, such as increasing the speed of maximizing and minimizing windowed applications, which is another feature that I also made use of. Regardless, thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, please leave a comment below because interaction with viewers will help boost this this video in the YouTube algorithm, and I guarantee that I'll respond to your comments. While you're at it, please subscribe because that helps a lot in video quality and production, also positively affects my day. Finally, leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below, and have a great day. Bye.